Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy, and I'm the Director of Professional Development here at the Southwestern Association for Episcopal Schools, and we are glad you're here. This is a really important webinar, Preparing for Strategic Planning, and it's a roadmap really for board members. We do another strategic planning webinar in April that we'll talk about later, but this webinar is particularly suited for board members who don't understand the strategic planning process, or maybe you're beginning that process. So we're glad you're here, and we're going to be spending the next 45 minutes talking about the process and hopefully getting you all the information you need to get started. So before we begin, as I said, I'd love for you to engage today. If you want to put anything in the chat, love to have you be engaged in that area. If you have questions, you can put that in the Q&A box, and I will do my very best to get to that. I'll check it periodically, and as we get to the end, we're going to have an opportunity for questions as well. So having said all that, let me just go ahead and jump right in to strategic planning. So I want to start just briefly with the idea of us looking at the trends that we should be considering as we begin the process of strategic planning. The National Association of Independent Schools puts out a trends book every year, and they do a really good job. It's a pretty thick book, but it really keeps up with what's happening in independent schools. And there are three trends that I would like for you to think about as you begin the process of strategic planning. The first one is enrollment management. Enrollment management is always going to be a conversation that boards should be having. I can tell you that there's not a school, small or large, that shouldn't think about enrollment management when they're planning strategically. There is a trend right now that there's a stagnation in population growth, which will influence enrollment. But I will also tell you that since the pandemic, I don't really have this particular data really backed up, other than my own experience recently with a lot of different schools, both in the association and in the Diocese of West Texas, that independent schools have really done well, believe it or not, in the pandemic. The way they've handled the pandemic, the way they've handled COVID has been really impressive. And I think that has helped enrollment trends. I've seen a number of schools talk about their enrollment going up. Whether that will stay, I couldn't tell you, but it's going to be something that you need to be thinking about. It's a trend that you need to consider. The second one is just the continuation of the board head relationship, and always making sure that that's an important aspect of planning. And then I think one that we always talk about is that boards should continue to ask the question, what is the value proposition of our school? What are we trying to accomplish here? What are we doing? What are our strategies? And do those play to our strengths? And I think that these are three trends that I would, as we talk about the strategic planning process, that I would encourage you to think about as you begin. The other thing that I want to just touch on, I know people are so sick of COVID. I know they're sick of it. I know they don't want to talk about it anymore. I am in full agreement with that. However, it's something we need to think about in terms of post-COVID. Now, we said this last year. We talked about this idea of post-COVID, and the reality is that we said it last year, and then the fall hit, and we thought we were going to be in great shape, and alas, we were not. So when I say post-COVID, I think many schools are really beginning to get beyond what they've been working on as far as pandemic, but some schools are still in the middle of that. And so of course, this depends on the community, but I think it's really important for you to think about it, because there's lots that we have learned from this experience. There's a book called Post-Corona: From Crisis to Opportunity by Scott Galloway. And I have not read the full book, but I have looked at a summary of it. And basically it talks about the things that businesses can bring out of the COVID conversation. And I think this applies to schools in two areas. Number one, there are a couple of things that he talks about. Number one, that the strong will get stronger. And number two, industry disruptions are going to be coming from the pandemic. And the truth is, we already know that in schools. We already know that the very strongest schools, the ones who were in good shape financially, the ones who were really strong in enrollment, they didn't get hit as hard as the other schools. And so always being strong and making sure that we're the healthiest school as possible is something that you should think about. And then the other thing is just the disruption. I think in schools, that's been true more than any place, is the absolute disruption that COVID has created in our schools. And so out of those two things, I would encourage our boards to ask the following questions. Number one, what have we learned? What needs to be considered as we begin to plan the future? I think that you could probably many people will write a book, and I think mostly schools could write books on all the things that they have learned about how to run a school in a pandemic. And so what are the things that we've learned from that, and what needs to be considered as we plan for the future? The second thing I think we should ask is, what needs have been indicated in our school? What has come up that has been a gap that we didn't know about when we first got started? And I think that these could be things like, what did we find gaps in our program? Did we find gaps in our facilities, in our governance structure? What are the things that we found that really were needs that we were not aware of before this pandemic? The third thing, and this is something I think schools have done a really good job about, is the idea of the hacks. What are hacks that have worked well? What are things that that we need to consider keeping? What are things that that worked really well that we never expected? You know, I had a couple of people talk to me about how a simple thing such as the way they did drop off and pick up. Those are things that seem to be areas in which they never thought that would work, to do a quicker drop off or a quicker pickup. And the way the COVID had required that they do it that way. And now it's stayed. You know, there are some things that worked really well that came out of that we can keep. The fourth question would be, what programs, traditions, or processes need to see the sunset? And I think this is really particularly hard for schools, elementary schools. My experience is in a parish day school, and people in parish day schools are particularly attached to their traditions, and especially if they've been around a long time. Parents are attached to tradition. But I think the question needs to be, is this still a tradition that's worth our time and our energy? And I can't answer that for you. I can just tell you that one of the questions as you begin to plan for the future should be, do we have any programs or traditions or processes that we've done in the past that we've always done it because that's the way we've always done it? Do we need to have those be sunsetted, get rid of those for a while? I think that's something that needs to be asked. And it's hard, it's challenging because people don't like change, but it should be a question we ask. So this slide here is up because I just want you as board members to understand a little bit about your role. You know, you're climbing a mountain here, and the point is strategic planning. The point is to get to the peak of the mountain and to look at the 50,000 foot view of your school. Where are we going to go? Where are we trying to get to? And you can't see that at the bottom of the mountain. And I think it's really important for boards to also remember that for the last 2 years, most schools have been really in the weeds. Even school boards, which we would normally not want them to be in the weeds, even the school boards have been in the weeds in terms of making decisions about things that they never thought they'd have to make decisions about. And so our goal today is to get you out of the weeds and to get you at the top of the mountain so that you can begin to see the whole school and where you guys are going. And so that's our goal for today. So let's talk about what we're going to be kind of hitting on today. What are some of the considerations that you need to consider as you design your strategic plan? What is the process? We're going to talk about the role of the board. We're going to talk about some basic steps for strategic planning, and we're going to finish up with some resources that you can look at, that you can use when you begin this process. And again, I want to encourage you to put questions in the Q&A. And as we go through, I don't mind stopping and answering questions, or we can do it at the end. So let's start with the role of the board. Many of you have seen this. If you've been on any of our webinars regarding governance, you've seen this particular slide. It's the National Association of Independent School puts out a trustee handbook. And this is probably the best slide I've ever seen on understanding the role of the board and the role of the head and what each person is kind of overseeing. And so I would encourage you to take a look at this slide, and let's talk about what your role is. Many new board members ask that question: what is my job? I'm not sure what my job is. Well, this slide does it better than anything. And as you'll see at the top, there's the first lane, which we call the policies lane, the board decisions, and that's really where board members spend most of their time. You'll see that it's not all the board's decision. They make these decisions based on their kind of how they walk through their decision-making process, and they take the head's advice on that. These are things like setting strategy, the mission, the survival of the school, leadership, major initiatives, major facilities things. These are the kinds of things that that nonprofit boards, independent school boards should be spending their time on. And as you'll see, strategic planning strategies is at the very top of that list. This is most definitely the board's work to do. And it's really important that you consider that your primary job. Remember that your job as a board member, there's three things that you're in charge of: fiduciary duties, strategic duties, and generative duties. And so you can see that strategic planning falls right in the middle of your strategic conversations. And we want you to be thinking about that. What would not be appropriate would be to say to your head or to your director, hey, go ahead and write a strategic plan for the next 3 years and bring it to the board and we'll approve it. That would not be appropriate, because as you can see, this is a board lane with the advice of the head. The head's involved, the head's guiding the conversation, but it's a board decision. So I really think that this is an important slide as we get into this conversation about what it is that is our job and what is not our job. All right, so what are the hallmarks of a solid process? There is a great consultant named Stephanie Rogan. She is the owner of Greenwich Leadership Partners. And she's she's written a couple of books on strategic planning. She's just an expert in her field. And she says this: too often, strategic planning doesn't engage community members in deep reflection about the purpose of the school or the experience of the students. And I just thought that was so profound, because the truth is that often we forget to ask the question, what is the student experience like at our school? I do think we talk more about the purpose of the school in our boards. I think we do that through the mission. I think that's more of a conversation that we have, but I think we often miss that question about what is the experience of the student like. And it doesn't matter if you have a standalone preschool with 25 kids or you have 500 students through high school. You should be asking, what is it like to be a student at our school? What are the students experiencing on a day-to-day basis? And how does that fit within the mission? Because that would be otherwise, why are we here? If we're not asking the question of that the students are ultimately the reason we're here. And so that really needs to be asked. And so I love the way that I love starting this conversation out with that quote. So people ask all the time, who should be involved in the strategic planning process? And I think the answer is maybe a little bit more nuanced than even what this slide talks about, because of course, depending on the size of the school and the way the school culture works, the short answer is that everyone should be involved on some level. But should everyone be in on the goal setting and all of that? I don't think so. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my thoughts about that in just a minute. But we begin with asking the question, who makes the decisions? Well, we've already talked about that. The board makes the decisions. The board sets the strategic plan of the school. But in order to know which way they should be going, they've got to ask a lot of questions. And so we're going to begin with creating a strategic planning task force, or what we would call a strategic planning committee. This is a subcommittee of the board, primarily board members. And this board committee's job is to guide the process, is to create the process, to decide how we're going to go about drafting the document, how we're going to do all of that. So they're kind of the worker bees of the board when it comes to beginning that process. Another group that should be involved is there's a group of people that when you have a retreat where you walk through and you talk about all of the different things that we're going to be talking about, who should be at that retreat? Well, I think that you could argue that in a bigger school, the more stakeholders you have at the retreat that can have some input, the better. Do I think that that's true for smaller schools? Maybe. One of the ways that we can get a lot of input is through surveys, which we're going to talk about. So do all of the people that were in on surveys need to be at the retreat? I don't know. I don't necessarily think so. I think you can have a few extra people at the retreat. I think you can have some people from the vestry. I think you can have some donors. It kind of depends on your school community, what they expect, how much input they expect. I've seen schools that put together a strategic planning community that is pretty big, that's 20 to 25 people. It includes all kinds of people from all kinds of stakeholders that are involved in it. And then I've seen schools that have a smaller group, but they get feedback through surveys and focus groups. And so I think you can do it both ways. But I think the big picture is that you want to have as much feedback as possible before you begin. I think that's really important. So yes to the strategic planning task force, yes to participants at the retreat, and yes, everyone should have some opportunity for some feedback. So now we're going to jump into the process of planning, and we've kind of got this by steps. And step one really is the primary work of the board. And that work is around is preparing to launch the strategic planning opportunity, strategic planning process. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the mission statement. If you have not looked at your mission statement and reevaluated it and made sure that it's still effective in a while, this is one of the first things that we want you to do. Understanding your mission, we're going to talk a little bit about mission and vision in just a minute, but understanding the mission, assessing the mission, making sure it's still relevant, that's super important before you begin the strategic planning process. Another thing that's important is the idea of getting everybody to agree that the timing is right to start. The timing has got to be right. I mean, a lot of people started the strategic planning process during March of 2020, and wow, that turned out to be a terrible time to do strategic planning. So everybody needs to agree that it's the right time for it. If you haven't done one in a while, it's probably the right time for one. Selecting the strategic planning task force. As I said, that's a board committee that should be led by board members. I think you can absolutely put other people on it. I think you can put vestry people on it or parishioners. I think you could but it needs to be people that are connected to the school and have a sense of what's happening at the school. So maybe a good representation of different stakeholders in your community. The next thing you want to do is establish a facilitation plan for a retreat. So are you going to have a retreat and who's going to facilitate that? Many people will do their own retreat. They'll do their own facilitation. The board chair will do it, or somebody on the committee will do it. It just kind of depends. But you can bring somebody in. You can bring somebody in to do a facilitation. Sometimes that's better because it kind of gets people more willing to talk about things than they would if it weren't for if it was just somebody on the board. So I think that you talk about that and you decide, how do we want to go about that? And then establishing a timeline and a budget. If you're going to bring somebody in, that's going to cost you a little bit more money. If you're going to retreat and it's going to be a 1.5-day retreat and you're going to do lunch and all of that, that's going to cost money. So establishing a timeline and a budget, reviewing the mission statement, making sure everybody's on board, that's the first step. That's preparing to launch, and that's the board's work. Okay, so step 2, this is a really, really critical step. And I call this data review because we're reviewing data, not just within our own school, but we're reviewing it across the board. So let me just start with industry trends. What I mean by industry trends is we want to take a look at what is happening in the independent school world. What is enrollment doing, not just in our own little school? What's it doing in our community? Are more and more people leaving independent schools and going to public school? Has our public school gotten really fewer and fewer people, and more people are going to independent schools? What's happening with enrollment within schools, within our community, and maybe even within our state? The second thing would be the economy. What's happening in your local economy? What's happening in your state economy? How is that going to affect our planning? If you're in a big city that has lots and lots of schools and it's the economy's booming, that's a different animal than if you're in a smaller community where maybe the one thing that brought families in has now been closed down. I tell the story about years and years ago, St. Albans in the 60s was one of the bigger schools, and then one of the military bases closed, and that changed enrollment immediately. And so those kinds of things are important to take a look at. Philanthropy. What's the state of philanthropy at your school? What's the state of philanthropy in your community? Are people giving? Is giving up? Is giving down? That's important. What are the industry trends for teaching and pedagogy? If you're a Montessori school, or is there a lot of need for Montessori schools, or people going to Montessori schools? What are the things that are happening in those areas? And then finally, competition. Again, it depends on where you are, but your competition may be other independent schools. Your competition may be public school. I don't know, but you need to take a look at that. So we want to take a look at all of the trends in the industry. And then we want to begin to take a look inward at our own institutional review. And I would begin with your accreditation report. If you are an accredited member of the association and you have a report, you most likely have quite a few things already that you can begin to work on strategically, because that's what the report, especially if it's a very new report. So I would take a look at your accreditation report and see what the big strategic things were that you need to do there. I would take a look at your financial dashboard and your financials. And I would be asking the question, what financially we need to be working on? Enrollment data. What's our personal enrollment been doing? Is it gone up? Is it gone down? Is it stabilized? Do we need to work on it? That data will be huge in terms of figuring out what you need to be focusing on. The SWOT analysis is a really important part, and we can talk about this in the constituency review also, but what are the strengths of the school? What are the weaknesses of the school? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? That's a basic thing that we do often in schools and in other businesses as well. Doing a SWOT analysis will really give you a sense of what your weaknesses are and what you need to be working on. And then finally, benchmarks. Benchmarks are things that help you know where you are. When we talk about the vital signs, some of you may have seen in the past a webinar that we did on the SAES vital signs. The vital signs are basically the benchmarks that we see. What are the things about new schools that the very best schools are doing? An example of this would be teacher salaries. one of the vital signs is that the teacher salaries are 85% or better of your local public school. So that would be a great benchmark to ask yourself the question, where do our teachers fit in that? And are they there? If not, that's probably a strategic initiative that you need to take a look at. Another one would be a financial benchmark. What is our cash flow like? What does our cash look like? Do we have 120 days of cash? That would be a benchmark that we would want you to consider. And if you don't, then there's a great strategic initiative for you. So looking at institutional review, looking at industry trends, and then finally, your constituency review. And that's really what are our people asking about? What are our people saying are our strengths and weaknesses? This can be done via surveys. It often is done via surveys. It can also be done via focus groups. Sometimes people don't want to fill out surveys, but they're happy to talk to you. So I like personally to do both of those things because it gets you more data, and that's really important. So the data review process is looking at industry trends, looking at your institutional review, what our institutional information is, and then finally asking our constituency what they think. So step 3, then once we've done all that, now it's time for us to develop some plans, some vision, and some goals. And this is typically where the retreat comes in. And it's typically done at a retreat. And what we try to do is we try to get you to create a vision statement. Make sure that you have a vision statement. And some people ask, well, what's the difference between a vision and a mission? Well, the vision statement describes where are we going in the future? What is the desired future of the school? It kind of provides a destination. Where do we want to be in 3 years? The mission is more the guiding light for how to get to that destination. Okay, so it's really important in this retreat time that everyone agrees on that vision, everyone agrees that the mission is correct. And remember that this step assumes that you've already looked at your mission. This is not the time to start over on the mission. We should have done that in step 1. This is the time where we take a look at both of those things. And from that information, from all the information that we got in step 2, we take a look at the vision, we take a look at the mission, and we come up with focus areas or goals that we're going to try to accomplish. And I would argue that 3 to 4 goals or focus areas is really the very best that you can do, because these are not small things. These are not check off the list things. These are big items that you're going to try to accomplish over a 2 to 3 year period. A lot of times people put the elements of the mission and the vision together, and that kind of gives you a statement of what the school looks like or a company looks like. And so mission and vision together and plus your institutional review gives you a good area for you to be able to pick the goals that you want to set in step 3. Okay, so step 4, this is where we begin to really develop action plans for each goal. After we have the retreat and we've got kind of our 3 to 4 focus areas, this is when we begin to create action plans for each of those areas. And so an example would be, okay, we want to increase non-tuition revenue. Non-tuition revenue would be things like we rent out the gym, and so we get rent from that, or we do some extracurricular activities, or we do after school care. Those are non-tuition revenue streams. And so let's say the goal is to increase non-tuition revenue. And so the action plan for that would be, we're going to identify all sources of that revenue. We're going to develop a plan for income streams that are viable. If we don't have a gym, that's not, we can't rent it out if we don't have a gym, or we can't maybe do a summer program if the gym is not in good shape. So what's actually viable? What's it going to cost? Assess the staffing needs of that. Develop a marketing plan. How are we going to find renters for the gym? How are we going to find people to go to our after school program or our summer program? So develop a marketing plan for that, and then assess the success. What's the metric? David Madison always talks about that it's really important to have metrics for goals. If we're going to set a goal, how do we know we've achieved it? The metric for this would be that we made money. that we have a revenue surplus, that we've increased our non-tuition revenue. So this is just an example of what that might look like. Another example that I don't have on here might be that we want to increase our fundraising, or we want to build up our development department or our advancement department. And so we might have, development as a goal, but we might say, instead of having 6 fundraisers, we want to have 2 fundraisers. And so we might take a look at how we're going to do that, and how we're going to do, combine those 6 fundraisers into 2. And how do we know that that's been successful? Well, we've made more money on 2 fundraisers than we did on 6. So when you set your goals, be sure that you are setting metrics so that you know whether you've been successful. So scenario testing is really when you take the plan and you take it back to the stakeholders to see if you've hit the mark. You can do this a couple of ways. I think before you go to the board, I think to go back to maybe the people that were at the retreat and take the plan and go, okay, here's what we've got in terms of focus areas. Here are our action plans. And because you want to make sure that you hit the mark. It's possible that you missed it. And you want to make sure that, especially if any of your plans include a capital campaign, you want to make sure that the people that were engaged in that, especially donors, are going to be excited about what you're doing. So I think this is a really important part if you're going to do that. So step 6 is plan adoption. So once the plan's been drafted and the plan comes to the board for approval, the board needs to approve it. And there's a couple of things that I want to say about this. Number one, it's really important not to get sucked in to minutia on the action plan. This is not a time where the board talks about the action plans and says, I don't like the wording on that. This is a bigger picture. The board's job here is really more about what's going to be the priority. Do we have the priorities right? We're going to do, in our first year, we're going to work on the financial goals. And the second year, we're going to work on the program goals or whatever. Is that the right way to do it? Is that what needs to come first? And how are we going to pay for this? Because remember that the board's job after strategically setting goals is to fund those goals. Otherwise, you just have a really nice wish list and you can't pay for it. So this is a really important part of the process. But I think the most important part on this slide is for you to know that your job is not minutia, it's big picture. So steps 7 and 8 really are around communication, celebration, and implementation. Now that you have a great plan, we do not want you to hide that plan. We don't want you to put that into a big notebook and stick it on the shelf. It needs to be, number one, communicated with your community, because they know you're doing it. You ask their opinion. And so if you ask the constituency's opinion and then you never tell them what you decided, it kind of messes with your credibility. So I think it's really important for you to communicate that properly to the community. I would not send out your strategic plan in detail, because that's a working plan. I would market it. So it may be that you take the strategic plan and you say to the community, here's what we're going to be working on over the next 3 years. And here's when we're going to work on it. To give detailed information is just really not helpful. So you want to make it celebrated in a way that people are excited about it, but they're not responsible for the details of it. The second thing is that you implement it. And I think it's really interesting. A lot of times we spend all this time working on all this great planning and great goals. And then we don't take the time at board meetings to talk about how we're implementing it. Or we just say to the head of school, good luck. And this is a project that we're all working on. And so we always recommend that you once a quarter, that the board spends once every quarter at least, you take the time to do a consent calendar where you don't spend any time on minutes or budget or anything like that. And you spend that time, that hour to hour and a half, talking about the strategic plan and where we are in it and what are we doing with it and who's doing what and are we making progress. And I think that that's really important. A lot of times that doesn't happen. I love this quote: even if you are on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. And that's true. That's true for strategic planning. And so I really encourage you to think about not only communicating this to your community, but how are we going to make sure that it's being implemented on the regular? So the final topic we want to talk about are just the resources that you might consider as you prepare for strategic planning. SAES has a number of resources that I think can be helpful to you. The first one is, if you're a member school, then you can get on the document library, and there's a document called Setting the Strategic Direction of Your School. And this document is really helpful. Of course, this webinar is going to give you a lot of the same information, but this will help you figure out where you need to begin. The second thing I would take a look at is the vital signs, the SAES vital signs. This is also in the document library. The vital signs are a great document for you to take a look at and go, okay, this is what great schools are doing. Where do we fit? What are we doing? Are we meeting these benchmarks? And I think that's a great place to start. Of course, the association standards are always a great place to start, to take a look at, especially if you're an accredited school. What are the standards of the association and what are we doing? How close are we to those? Another thing that you can get from SAES, on the website, is there's some surveys that you can take a look at. If you aren't sure how you want to do your survey, you can get on there, and there's some free surveys that you can download. There's also the ability to have SAES do those surveys for you. It's a fee-based consultation, but sometimes it's good to have an outside person come in and do the survey. People often are more likely to talk to an outside person and tell them what they really think. Sadly, you wish that they would talk to you, but it just seems to work better when you're talking to an outside person. And of course, finally, we've got some facilitation services that if you're looking for an outside facilitator, SAES does do that on a fee-based as well. I am going to give you a shameless plug that we're going to be doing a 2-hour webinar on April 5th from 5:30 to 7:30. And this is going to get a little bit more detailed about strategic planning and long-range financial planning. And this would be a great webinar if you are really, now that you've seen this, kind of understand the process. This goes a little bit more of a deep dive. And it also adds in long-range financial planning, which is kind of the sister to strategic planning. As I said, it makes no sense to do strategic planning and then not make a plan for how you're going to pay for all the things that you decided you would do. A couple of other resources that you might consider if you are interested in doing DIYing this. NAS puts out a great book called The Strategic Process. That's a good one. They also put out, as we talked a little bit about, the NAIS Trustee Handbook. That's a great resource for this. And then finally, Stephanie Rogan's, we talked a little bit about Stephanie Rogan earlier. She wrote a book called Creating Blueprints That Schools That Thrive. It's a blueprint for strategy. It's a great book. It's got activities in it. And if you are interested in doing this yourself and facilitating this yourself, that's an excellent resource. So at this time, what I'd really love to do is just entertain any questions that you might have, any comments, anything that we haven't covered that you want to know a little bit more about. If you'll stick that in the Q&A box, I'd be happy to answer those questions. I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot of information at once. And if you're new to your board, it could be kind of overwhelming. So I would encourage you not to be overwhelmed. If you've registered for this webinar, you're going to get a copy of this slide deck, and you can take a look at it again. You can read anything on the website that we have available, and you can also ask me questions. So if you want to have any questions, anything in there that you'd like to ask, feel free to throw it in the Q&A. While we're waiting, this is my email address. This is our phone number at the SAES office. We'd always be happy to visit with you further, answer any questions. And let's see, we do have a questions. The viewing of the recording of the webinar. So this webinar is recorded, and it will be available in a couple of in a couple of days. It usually takes a couple of days for that to be. So what I'm going to do now, if I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and tell you thank you for coming. And if I'm going to hang around for just a minute and answer more questions, but if you're watching this and just want to say thanks for coming and being a part of this, it's been great having everybody. And we're going to stop the recording.